Hey folks, welcome to the Mac and Mike show. I'm Mac and he's Mike, and we're going to have one of these interesting tete-a-tete conversations today because I think we've got a couple of topics that Mike and I have slightly different views on. And the way we're going to start this off is by talking about the news earlier or late in the week, earlier the past couple of days, recently, I guess. Um, President Donald Trump signed an executive order changing the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War. And it's kind of interesting because, of course, the Department of War was what it was originally named. And that was named as we were fighting wars, predominantly over in Europe, but all over in many places across the globe. And so we changed it from the Department of War to the Department of Defense. And I'm sure there will be a lot of people explaining to you why we did that. You know, we did that because we don't want to be thought of as being a nation that is actively seeking out war, but rather a military that is set up and established to defend our homeland. But Mike, you like the change.
Well, I like the wording. The only problem I have is potentially the amount of money it's going to cost to change everything. But I guess Congress will have to get behind that in order to change the buildings, and it's a lot of paperwork. That's my biggest bugaboo with it. But I
Mike,
think it,
is it much different than all these statues of historical figures that we've torn down and destroyed and melted down? Is it much different than changing names of a dozen or so military bases around the country because all of a sudden we didn't like the name?
I didn't approve of that either. So besides the expense, I think it does send a clear signal to our adversaries that they are on notice, that we are a country who is not just interested in self-defense. We are not complete isolationists, and that we will come to the aid of our allies if called upon. And number two, I think it sends a signal to those that might join the military that we're a little bit more serious than we have been in the past. I think war has a connotation of being more serious than defense. Um, as you know, I'm a little bit more aggressive, possibly, than you when it comes to war. I don't like to see it. I don't think war is a good thing. But I don't think, on the other hand, we need to cower or play footsies with words. I'm a very direct person when it comes to a fight. Now, when it comes to interpersonal social settings, I'm very nice and mellow, I guess, but don't pick a fight. Um, that'll get either me killed or somebody else hurt. One or the other.
President Theodore Roosevelt famously said, walk softly and carry a big stick. And someone else coined the phrase, strong fences make for good neighbors. And I don't know who is responsible for the second quote, but I think that Donald Trump is much more brusque, direct, and upfront than many of our past presidents who were more, as you use the term, maybe they were more politically correct and they were more attuned to the political than they were to the business of governing. You know, governing is not an easy thing, and you've got to manage a lot of different personalities. At the same time, you have to keep moving forward towards your goal. You know, when Ronald Reagan was president, he said one time famously, "It's amazing how much you can get done when you don't care who gets the credit." And I think that what Donald Trump is interested in doing is, and you can see this in so many different ways. I mean, he did change many of those former military bases back to their original name. But also, you can see it in the way the public responds to him. You know, earlier this year, or at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, we were way off on our recruiting goals for the military, and that was true of all branches, even the Marine Corps. and I love it what the military does whenever they don't make their quotas, the number of draft, number of new trainees that they're looking for. They always adjust their numbers down and say, "Oh no, we met our goal. We just, we." So they changed the numbers to fit how much. But we were running 10 for a while there. We were running 10,000 recruits a day. I mean, that's how many people wanted to volunteer to serve in President Trump's army. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said when we were an army that wanted to play games with the physical fitness test so that people who were not necessarily the strongest and fittest could could be in the military. And when we made special arrangements for various kinds of, what do you call them, non-normative Americans. When we made special arrangements for non-normative Americans to join the military, I think that really impacted the number of, I don't want to call them real Americans, because you can be a real American without being a volunteer for the military. But I guess what I'm saying is that the people who traditionally have joined the military, strong men with how do they term it? Toxic masculinity. Those are the guys that we typically wanted to see in the military, and I think those were the ones that were turned off by what we were rapidly becoming as a military, not just interested in defending this nation or prosecuting war when it was in our nation's best interest, but maybe making it more of a political entity, and maybe making it more of a experiment in social engineering. And I think that when Donald Trump, like this decision to change the name back to the Department of War, I think that sends a strong signal to those more traditional recruits who are interested in joining the military.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
have.
I have.
Well, I got some feedback there. I have no problem with non-normatives wanting to join the military as long as they don't make it inconvenient for the rest of us. As you know, I said I had a lesbian friend that was top notch. She didn't make it inconvenient. You wouldn't, the least impressive thing about her was her lesbianism, and she didn't talk about it, and never made a point and that's fine. I also believe people need to be academically uh, suited for the position that they go to, not just strong physically. Strong physically, absolutely. And they didn't used to really have many girls in the career field I was in. And I'll never forget when we got our first one. They did. They had to gerrymander the test. They said, "Oh yeah, she passed." No, she didn't. And that happened 2 times. And eventually, these girls had to be put out. And not only that, even though my career field didn't require a extremely high academic score, although I had one that I could have done anything, um, I obviously noticed, because we had the test scores on the OJT records when I would pull them out to train people, and you could tell the people with the lower academic scores were typically much harder to train.
Yeah.
And so I think some of the standards need to be raised, not just physically, but mentally.
I think part of the change of the name from Department of Defense back to the Department of War also sends a signal to our allies and to our enemies. Maybe I should call them our opponents, the nations who do not wish us well. I'm sure that when um, President Putin sits back and tries to determine how he's going to prosecute the war in Ukraine, that this more aggressive nature of the military of the United States. I mean, when you say defense, that means I'm standing back here, don't hurt me, we're gonna protect ourselves. When you say war, you're saying, hey, watch out, I can reach out and punch you in the nose at one of these times. And I think those two words are a tool used by President Trump to let our enemies know that he means business. I would say the same thing about President Xi. You know, one of the big concerns we have in the sphere of influence that China has is what's going to happen to the island of Taiwan, which is a sovereign nation. And if you go back in history, both Taiwan and China, mainland China, both wanted America to recognize a one China policy because each of those two entities thought they were the one China. So we have this, quote, one China policy, which the communist Chinese have turned into, well, that island that's out there off the coast, that's just part of our mainland, and one of these days we're going to get it back. And I don't think that's what the United States wants to have happen necessarily. And again, I think that the whole idea of the Department of War, not that it's a significant change. We didn't change anything on the inside. We just changed the name, and that name gives a much more aggressive kind of connotation than the Department of Defense.
Well, the thing about Taiwan is, of course, their chip manufacturing.
Yes.
I mean, that's the biggest thing. I'm sure they have other exports. But again, when you say America's interests, other than the chips, I don't know really that we have a great interest in Taiwan, except to try and promote freedom among, the Asian region. And it's kind of funny. I noticed China was in a skirmish, kind of a war with Vietnam in 1979. And the Chinese got beat back. Not completely. They hurt each other bad. I think on each side they killed 100,000 people. But the Chinese kind of gave up. So I know that was, what, 50 years ago, but it sort of tells you something. They had enormous numerical odds, but they just didn't know how to get their war together. That's America excels at plans and backup plans. We know how to fight wars. So I think if we've taught Taiwan anything, the Chinese might be in for a skirmish that they're not expecting from Taiwan without much involvement from us.
You know, Mike, it's not something I think we should necessarily be proud of, but it is a skill that the United States of America has. We know very well how to go places and make lots of people dead. We do. We're very, very good at that. And we're very, very good at the land, sea, and air ways of making people dead. It's just the truth. We've had a number of years of practice, and we are truly better at that than most any other organization, most any other country of the world. So yeah, we're pretty good in that arena. And that's important, I think, because it lets our enemies know that they shan't or don't or shouldn't consider taking us on. See, obviously, you remember World War II, World War One. Most of that war was fought not on our soil, but on foreign soil, Europe and those places. Um, so we are protected somewhat by the fact that we have oceans on either side of us, and for the most part, friendly nations north and south of us. So we're not likely to have a cross-border war. But the world has become a much smaller place, and the technology of war is changing rapidly. And, is it possible for the United States of America to prosecute a war without our satellite for both intelligence and guidance? Yes. Is it a lot more difficult if we don't have all that technology available to us? I mean, one of the ways we help our friends is by give them signal intelligence and human intelligence, a lot of which we gather through use of technology.
Well, yeah, I think that would be the big thing. That the war front has changed as we notice between Ukraine and Russia. They're using a lot more drones. And I think I know America's not sitting back and just letting these guys fight it out without learning a lot ourselves. And I'm sure our war planners have said, okay, this is the new way it's going to happen. And we are developing, if we have not already developed, tools and techniques and technology that will probably overwhelm the enemy, including China, because they have these drones that they put up in the air for demonstration, which you know can be used in war. You think that hasn't caught the attention of
Yeah.
people inside our military? Obviously. I know
Well,
we have a way to stop it.
we've signed treaties with the major powers of the globe, and that includes China and Russia, which states we will not weaponize
Space, yeah.
the skies above us. And yet we also know that we know for sure that China has already weaponized space, and we believe that Russia has as well. So there's no doubt in my mind that we too have weaponized, and we recognize that that's one of the vulnerabilities of using technologies to prosecute a war, is that in the absence of technologies, that makes us weaker. But I think that the whole idea of the War Department puts our allies more at ease and our enemies more on their toes. So I'm not opposed to it. I am surprised that he did it. I can't say I'm unhappy or displeased that he did it. As you noted, you changed a lot of letterhead and a lot of envelopes and a lot of signs on doors and stuff, and there is a significant expense to all that. But I do think maybe in this case it might be worth it. Putin obviously is pushing the boundaries of what we're willing to accept in the Ukraine war. And of course, China, with its efforts in the South China Sea, they're basically trying to take over that entire area where, what is it, some 70% of the world's commerce goes through that area, I think, with all of the manufacturing that's done in that part of the world. So it's significant. And I think the idea of the Department of War instead of Department of Defense certainly gives us a different level of footing and a different perspective from both our allies and our enemies.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how much it's going to matter in the long run. Um, the future is difficult to predict, but I'll say this. I remind you that I've said this before. I don't want to repeat myself too much, but my ninth grade social studies teacher. Now, when I was in ninth grade, that was like 1972, something like that. So we're going back quite a ways. He said, in your lifetime, you will see the Soviet Union and China become more like the United States, and the United States will become more like the Soviet Union and China. And sure enough, that's happened in my lifetime. And it's really significant if you look at China. They allow a certain amount of sort of quasi-free enterprise
Mm-hmm.
because they know if they let people profit, they'll work harder. That's one of the big mistakes they made with communism. So the only real difference, between the United States and China is basically our form of government and the civil liberties aspect. I mean, if you went to China, as long as you're a peace-loving Chinese person, and you're not making any trouble, you can walk around freely, get something to eat, I'm sure enjoy life a little bit. Just don't step out of line with the government. And in some
But
ways, well, go ahead.
But isn't that the biggest difference between our form of government and our ideology versus the communists?
Yes.
I mean,
That,
doesn't the Constitution guarantee us certain rights? And I know the truth is that many of those rights are violated on a daily basis, but a weekly basis certainly. But isn't aren't those ideals worth embracing and worth fighting for? The 10 Amendments to the Constitution of the United States, collectively known as the Bill of Rights, aren't they there to protect individual rights? And doesn't the Constitution call out governments are formed among men in order to, protect those rights? I mean, that's pretty much verbatim what it says. And the difference between a government like Russia or China is that in America, even even though Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia argues against it. In America, rights are granted by our Creator, and they are protected by government. In the governments you mentioned in China and Russia, rights are granted by government, meaning they can be taken away whenever they want to.
Yeah, I mean, but stop and think, of course, China also has the human rights problem. So
Sure.
they have Uyghurs and other people that they enslave,
Yep.
Christians, and things like that. But if you stop and think, in a sense, we have something similar in America. When the Democrats under Joe Biden let whatever how many millions it was, arguments between 10 and 20 million illegal immigrants flood into this country. There's a lot of speculation on why. But at the bottom of it, we know that they lost track of 300,000 children. A lot of the workers are working as slaves, as prostitutes, as drug runners. And isn't that a form of what the Chinese do to the Uyghurs and to the others? It's a little different, but it's a human rights violation to allow 10 or 20 million people into this country to become basically slaves. You look at our inner cities and what Trump's doing in DC and threatening to do in Chicago. Uh,
Brilliance.
so you look at human rights, okay? Are the government officials protecting the rights of the minority community within their bigger cities? I mean, sure, the majority white area is fine, but get into the black and Hispanic areas of any large city in America, they're killing each other. And
Yep. I'm,
the
I'm not
government
sure.
officials are turning a blind eye and not protecting their rights to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, I'm not real sure that it is a racial issue or a one of. I think it certainly is an economic issue. I mean, poor people of all colors, races, and creeds fall into those poor neighborhoods where the crime happens. So it's not just minorities. It's people of all the spectrum.
Well, I'll
And
beg to differ, but we'll talk about that in a minute.
well, you're right. I mean, you know, things that would not happen. Do you remember the couple who ran out in St. Louis, who ran outside on the porch of their gated community with their guns to keep
Yes.
the protesters from taking over their house?
Yep.
Um, they went to trial. They were adjudicated, and then the governor had to give them a pardon. And it was but the reason I bring up them is that you don't see 50 shootings on the weekend in their neighborhood. You see that in the south side of Chicago. You don't see that in the gated community in St. Louis where that couple live. So I get what you're saying about the skin color, but I do believe more than being a racial thing, it's a socioeconomic thing. Like there are a lot of white people who live in poor neighborhoods.
Yeah, and I'm still going to disagree with you.
Go ahead, disagree.
Yeah, I want to get this point out. I had learned some time back that during the Great Depression, when poverty had engulfed the United States, that crime did not increase proportionally. Poverty has very little to almost nothing to do with crime. Of course, if you steal bread, if you're hungry, I get that. But it doesn't excuse people breaking into stores and doing this. What it really is, and it's not skin color either, it's not racial, but it is cultural. And there is a predominant cultural view that's different among certain races. And I remember as a kid, I had a lot of Italian friends. You went into Little Italy in New York, you could walk down the street any time of the day or night and not worry about a darn thing. Nobody was going to mess with you because they kept tight control. That was their culture. You came to my neighborhood, it was different. You couldn't go down one end of the street or the other after the night lights came on because there were two rival gangs at each end of the street. So it's what we permit and what we allow, and those cultural things are different among not. I mean, Italians are Caucasians, but they have a different culture. Irish are you and I being Irish, we have a different culture. you know? And so the predominance just happens to fall within certain things. Now, when it comes to blacks, I've often pointed out Nigerians are black, but they're some of the wealthiest and they're some of the culturally best people in this country. So it has nothing to do with race, but there is I say, a small racial component to the cultural differences, and violence has little to nothing to do with poverty.
Well, when we were talking about crime and you used the words minority, I assumed you were talking about skin color and racial or ethnic origins. And I just wanted to point out that, being poor is nothing to be ashamed of. There's lots of reasons why someone might fight themselves in those circumstances. But I do think that in the poor neighborhoods, criminals get away with a lot more than they do in the more wealthy neighborhoods.
Are they poor because there's more criminals, or is it criminal because there's more poor? It's like which came first, the chicken or the egg. I'm sure there is a certain dynamic of that working together. But again, we go back to the Great Depression. That seems to have dispelled the idea that poverty causes more crime.
Well, I would argue that societally, we were different in in the 1930s, you know, um, and that people were generally different in the 1930s.
The culture.
Sure, that's what I'm saying.
Yep.
So, um, yeah, I'm not sure that you can use the culture of the 1930s to describe the crime or lack of crime thereof in today's society. Because, Mike, we're much less religious, we're much less believers in God, we're much more crass and vulgar. And that's portrayed, that you can see that in our music and in our movies and our television shows. Um, you know, you're probably right. Culture has a big impact on whether or not there's crime or not. And my only point is that today, culturally, the entire nation is different than it was 100 years ago.
Well, I'll agree, especially on the religious front. You and I have discussed that in the past. And the diminishment of belief in God, or even fear of punishment, whether it's from God or authorities, that is going to affect your cultural view. Look at what's happening in DC. You got a 17-year-old couple 17-year-olds that are just arrested, and I don't know, did they find the 18-year-old yet that killed the
No,
intern?
no, I don't think so.
So at some point, we decided that we were going to try and rehabilitate these young people and not hold them to account because their brains aren't fully formed or something.
Mike,
Well,
we're going to have to wrap this up. We're not fully done with this, but I've got problems outside where I'm at, so I got to go.
okay.
All right.
All
Let's
right,
say
brother.
Mac and Mike
Out.
out.